Today we're going to show you how to integrate Pharos with Chief Integration ShowRunner lighting control software. We're going to go ahead and go into Load Hardware Setup. And we're going to find the Pharos DMX controller, which would have been created for you when we ship the config. If you provide us the load information, we'll add them ahead of time, but quite often with DMX, that information isn't available until on site. So we'll pre-configure the controller, and then you can go ahead and add the loads from the interface. So on the right side of the screen here, we have Pharos config. There's nothing special here. This is just our demo project. And we've got, what's most important is that the controller API is set to 2.0 or higher. We are using the Pharos API to prevent any need for custom hooks within the Pharos control software. So there are no custom triggers here. Everything is handled via the API. Now within the layout, I've pre-created some RGB fixtures, some static white, warm cool, and then we have a RGBW split. Pharos' default profile for the RGBW fixtures automatically mixes the lights. So generally people want control of the white channel separately from the RGB. So typically we'll use the RGBW split fixture. Now we're going to go ahead and add these loads. We're going to go into the configure loads page of the ShowRunner GUI. Now I don't have any loads right now, but with Pharos we reference the group numbers. So each one of these folders here is a group. We've got 1, 8, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. I'm going to go ahead and add these loads in. I'm going to put in load 1, and this is a RGB fixture. We're going to assign it to boardroom A. We'll go ahead and label it here. We'll call it Cove. And then we're going to add group 8, which is also an RGB fixture. It's going to go in boardroom B, and this is the cove for boardroom B. We're going to add the bookshelves, group 4 for boardroom A. Single channel fixture. And now for boardroom B. And then we're going to add the linears for the lobby on group 6, and this is a dynamic white intensity CCT fixture. And then we're going to add the lobby accent RGB, which is on group 7. And the lobby accent white channel on the RGB fixture. Single channel, put it in the lobby. Accent white. All right, so we have now added Pharos loads to our system. We can then access them. Go back out here to boardroom A. We'll see our cove. We have another cove that's a white channel that already existed. But I can go ahead and manipulate the value here, and if I go to our Pharos on the output side, we'll see those levels populated, and we can see that those are patched. Fixture 1 is patched to channel 1, so if we go ahead and move these, we can see our RGB values here, and they're populating correctly on the channel. So very, very simple process to add your Pharos loads. Now we can also go over to the lobby and we can see our other fixtures. We've got our accent RGB. Make sure we set the saturation. If you want to specify specific values, you can also type them in. So we can see that the accent RGB, we haven't patched that yet. So that won't work, but it is communicating with the Pharos. Now, one of the great features about the Pharos integration is we can also do what's called scene tracking. So say we've set up some timelines here, and for simplicity's sake, we assume that these are activated by Boardroom A. These are all defined. So I'm going to turn on scene tracking, which tells the Pharos to listen to any defined enabled areas for any scene changes. So I'm going to go ahead and enable it for Boardroom A, and then I'm going to map the meeting scene to my timeline ID 1, which is, I called scene 1. We can rename this to meeting. These are just demos. These are unlikely to be actual configurations. We'll timeline 1. And then we would say we want presentation to call scene 2 here. We'll relabel this presentation. Timeline 2, add that. Say we got a movie, that's going to be scene 3. All right, so we've mapped these timelines here. Now, we don't have to use all of them. What we can do, though, what's going to happen is when you recall these scenes in Boardroom A, the Pharos will start the appropriate timeline. And you can see that in the project status here. You can see scene 1 is running. Now, if we go ahead and hit scene 3, we'll see scene 1 was released and scene 3 is now running. No custom programming on the Pharos. All happens automatically based on your configuration in ShowRunner. Now, one thing to be aware of, when you do define loads, when you recall the loads, the scene recall happens before the load recall. So if you have a load defined as part of that scene, it's going to go ahead and trigger the Pharos to override the timeline for that particular load. But it's very important that if you want the timeline to control that load, that you go ahead and uncheck the appropriate loads that you want to run in this timeline. In this case, we've got the coves. Let me go ahead and relabel our loads here so that they're distinct. Because that one's cove, and we want cove RGB. Make sure that's distinctly identified. And we'll see cove RGB updated here. Let me change that in Boardroom B as well. Cove RGB. So we can see if we go to Boardroom B, cove RGB is updated as well. So go back here to our settings for our area configuration and our scene setup, where we can check whether or not loads are going to be included. So I'm going to uncheck the cove RGB for the meeting, presentation, and movie scenes. That means that when we recall that scene, the Pharos timeline will be responsible for controlling that load. So you see this load won't change. Now, we don't have real-time feedback from the Pharos to show you exactly what color it's on. That would be too much data for us to handle. So you'll just see that that load does not change. If you want to manually override it, you can always go in here. Make sure you set your saturation with the Crestron RGB picker. And then you can also make your changes here. This will override the Pharos timeline. So if we go to the Pharos, we'll see the timeline's running, but our output on cove RGB1 is fixed. Now if I go ahead and recall the scene again, we'll see that that load is now changing with the Pharos timeline. So it's important to understand the priority sequence when this is occurring. Scenes are recalled first. If you have a load included in the scene, it's going to recall after, and it will override the Pharos. If you make any changes while the timeline is running to that load, it will also override the Pharos timeline for that load. So important details to remember, but it allows a tremendous amount of flexibility, because you could have some scenes that are fixed and configured by the user, and you can have other scenes that are recall timelines within the Pharos. It's also very easy to update your timeline recall. You can go back here to scene tracking. You can just click on this and say, okay, instead I want to recall timeline 5 and just update it. And now when I recall scene 1 or the meeting scene, it's going to play Pharos timeline number 5. So say it's a hot meeting, you've got this flicker here. Very, very powerful way to tie DMX lighting within ShowRunner.